Perfect. Good morning, everybody. Today we are hosting a virtual working session. Um, this is going to be a little bit different. Some of you may have attended our sessions that we had in person. We unfortunately did have to cancel our South Florida session due to a hurricane, but we hope that we can uh, gather everybody in person in South Florida at some point in the future in the same format that we had the other sessions. This one is going to be a little bit different. So, with those sessions, we had a lot of time for people to sit down with their groups and look at their records and start making some priorities and making changes or just examining their metadata. Um, because this is virtual, we didn't feel that would be productive. So instead of that, we'll have a group discussion with questions to kind of help you get in that mindset and bring that back to your organization to have those conversations there. Um, so we'll begin today's session with a short presentation. It's going to be a very brief introduction to these concepts. And with some examples, and then we'll go into discussion with the group. So today's session is being recorded, just the presentation portion is being recorded. The discussion portion will not be recorded, but we'll provide those questions in the recording description for anyone who's watching this later. And my name is Kayla Zayas Ruiz. I'm the Sunshine State Digital Network Coordinator. We've been offering training around this topic for the last couple of years. And this presentation and the materials we'll be discussing today were prepared with the assistance of a grant that we received from the Division of Library and Information Services at the Department of State. Through the Institute of Museum and Library Services and Technology Act grant. So we want to acknowledge that. And I have also enabled live transcription for this session. So if you need closed captioning, just hit the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. And if you don't want to see those, you can also turn them off there. Please be aware that they are automated, so there may be some transcription errors in the captions. Okay. Does anyone have any questions, comments, or concerns before we get started? Okay. So we're going to start with defining these concepts. The two things we're going to be talking about primarily today are inclusive metadata and then conscious editing. And these are terms that you may have heard in the past. So inclusive metadata is going to be the theory around the work that's happening. And then the conscious editing is the actual practice that's happening to incorporate inclusive metadata in the into our collections descriptions. So I'm not going to read these out loud. Everyone here can read. So these are just the definitions for these two terms, but just in general, one is the theory and one is the practice. So that's how we're defining them for the purposes of this session. So when incorporating when incorporating inclusive metadata practices in your collections materials, you want to think about letting your users know that this work is happening, what that means, and being transparent about the process, as well as being able to incorporate any user feedback that you might be getting while you're doing this work. So you can do that through harmful language and content statements that are posted on your website or repository or even on collections descriptions. So these statements provide context to users about the efforts that you're putting in for this work. So here are some examples of these statements. So this statement example explains why the types of materials you see in a collection are collected, preserved, and presented online. And it refers specifically to the content and language of materials themselves rather than to the descriptions of those materials. So I'll let everybody read that. So would be an example of a harmful content statement, again, because it's referring specifically to the material and not to the descriptions. So this is an example of a harmful description, a harmful language statement about the description. So this statement addresses the goal of the library to provide respectful representation in their collections, the practices that led to potentially offensive or harmful descriptions, and provides information about ongoing efforts to update and remediate problematic descriptions. So those are two examples. One is related to the content and one is related to the descriptions themselves. So when thinking about these statements, you can combine them, right? So they don't have to be mutually exclusive of each other. You can have a combined statement that addresses both of these things and can provide the full context of the work that's happening. You again may decide to add these statements either to your entire repository, to individual records, or to collection pages. Um, some collections you might want to be more specific about what people might encounter in the collection that they're looking at. But you want to be mindful that collection statements won't appear when people find the items themselves on their own. So that's also something to consider if your items are being indexed outside of your repository in Google searches and things like that. So that's why you might want to consider the actual content of your collections and see when it's appropriate to apply more specific statements to items, collections, or just to the repository in general. And a really important part of these statements and the transparency around this work is providing a method for users to give you feedback when they encounter offensive or harmful content in your repository. So when you present this opportunity, either through a feedback form or an email contact, you want to ensure that users understand this issue and can easily find where they can report the problem and provide solutions potentially as well. At FSU, we have a form that asks for the item identifier, asks what the issue with the record or the item is, as well as provides the user with an opportunity to provide suggestions for how we can improve the information that we're providing for that record. So it gives them an active part in that process as well. It's also a form that does not require them to include their email so that they can provide anonymous feedback if they're not comfortable being contacted or being identified in the process of sharing their feedback. So that's something that we've decided to do in our process. So it's instead of an email address, it's a form that allows the user to be anonymous in their reporting. And yeah, so that's harmful content and language statements. So the next thing that you might want to consider um, is analyzing your collections for this type of language or potentially harmful content. So you want to work to identify and prioritize collections that likely have content or language that may be harmful. You can do this in various ways. So you can look at specific date ranges, right? So if you're aware that you might have material from the civil rights era, right? You want to narrow down by date, and then you can narrow down by subject. At FSU, we have a lot of materials related to plantations and plantation records. So we know that we want to focus those searches in the late, in like the 18th and 19th centuries, right? Um, and and although like the content of the descriptions themselves might not be have contain harmful language or content themselves, they might require additional context. So we know we're looking in that time range for things that we might have omitted, not just things that might be offensive, right? So adding context about enslavers and plantation owners, adding context about um, enslaved peoples that might not be there, right? So if the records may contain names or locations for enslaved people, that might be something we want to include so that it's more easily searched. Um, and uh, you know, just examining the language that we've used in those records. So time periods, subject areas, just there's different ways that you can try to narrow down and then prioritize based on that. Then you want to develop a list of terms that may reside in your description. So there's different resources you can use to find terms. Our part-time employee that we hired to help us with this work um, did locate a resource called the Racial Slur Database. It's something that has been helpful to her in identifying terms that she may not have been familiar with that could potentially be reside in our materials or our descriptions. Um, we have also used APA guideline for inclusive description or for inclusive writing, and that resource is linked here. We'll talk about that a little bit more later too. But that resource includes examples of language you don't want to use and also provides you suggestions with language that you may want to use instead. So you can use that to develop your list of terms to try to identify the language that you're trying to avoid to see if that's there. So there's various ways that you can develop that list, especially since most of us are probably not experts in offensive terms. So it helps broaden the scope of where you can locate that and build that list. Uh, Also depending on what materials you may have. So that way you're not just searching randomly. And then you want to identify useful thesauri. And we have a list of thesauri that we'll also be talking about and providing to everyone at this session. And these will help provide alternative language as well for any collections that you may have that you want to either avoid using some LCSH terms that might be outdated and provide some additional reference words for people to search with. And then another consideration when analyzing your collections is considering erasure and laudatory language. So in a lot of our records and historically, we have often used words like preeminent or important or just words that are flowery and kind of unnecessary. I have some examples at the end of this of how you can look at that and modify it. so that you're not um, elevating people who are already elevated, um, beyond and adding bias into those descriptions. And then when considering erasure, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but trying to identify either enslaved people. Very oftentimes, women are also erased in our description and records. Um, so, trying to identify people that are either explicitly named in the material but not in the descriptions, so they're kind of not searchable, um, and or identifying people other than like Mrs. Husband's name. So giving people individuality beyond their marital or social status, that might not have been considered when the records were being written. So those are some things that you can consider when analyzing your collections. And erasure is a really hard one because it's hard to search and assess what's not there. But if you know that you have collections related to enslavement or women's rights, or um, even other records where you are aware that women are present but maybe not noted, it's something to keep in mind. But it can be a little bit more challenging, but something to definitely be aware of. Okay, so legacy descriptions and ongoing policies. So there are various ways to approach this work. You can it's kind of broad, so you can either start with focusing on remediation, so analyzing and assessing your collections. If you feel like that's really daunting because you have a ton of legacy stuff and you're like, oh, this is too much, I have a backlog of all this new stuff, you can also just approach it from developing workflows and policies for new description, right? So from this point forward, this is the practice that we're going to follow. This is what we're going to look out for. This is the kind of language that we're going to use. These are the resources we're going to use to develop inclusive metadata practices in our description from now on. And then we can revisit all of this legacy stuff later. So if that's more manageable for you, it's definitely something, a way that you can approach this work that makes it um, more manageable and more approachable, so that you're not just thinking about, oh, I have to redo all of this old stuff, right? So and you can also just approach it in, okay, we're going to remediate and we're going to carry these same practices forward from now on as well. So there's a combination of ways to approach how you're going to tackle this for your organization. And also remember that this work is not done in a silo. So either talk to other colleagues within your organization or in your area that also do cataloging or write descriptions for digital collections or for finding aids, and seek expertise within your communities. So if you're at an academic organization, maybe seek subject experts either within your library or within the departments that might have some more specialized expertise and knowledge in the materials that you're trying to describe. Or if you're at a public institution, looking at the materials that, looking at the community or organizations in your community that might have expertise on the materials that you have. So if you have a genealogical society or even a very enthusiastic genealogist that visits your library, that might be able to help you identify people or might be able to help you identify places, right? So seeking subject experts and people outside of your department and yourself that might be able to assist you with this work, because it's not something that can be done or should be done on your own. Distinguishing content and standards. So thinking about published and monographic materials that may have some more limitations, right? So we know when working in MARC and many ILSs, there might be more limitations regarding which vocabularies you can use and how you address notes or content and language statements. So I know in Florida in particular, if you're at a public university or college, we all share the same ILS. There are some limitations on which notes fields we can use, which notes fields are visible, which ones are not. Um, some similar limitations might occur with digital library systems when you may be able to hide fields. If you want to retain offensive language but not make it visible to the user, but still make it searchable, there might be some limitations in your system there. So considering what those limitations are and what you can do with the system and the vocabularies that you're able to pull from. DAX, which is used in archival description, does offer a middle ground between archival authority and local flexibility due to the varied nature of archival collections at individual organizations. So this flexibility allows for adaptability to conscious inclusive metadata practices because DAX is designed to describe unique things, right? Rather than published material that is going to be at might exist in multiple places. So there's less standardization and more flexibility there. And then even more flexible than DAX is digital collections metadata because this is designed specifically to describe individual items rather than like a broad collection, right? So it's even more flexible than DAX might be. Dublin Core and mods offer a lot of flexibility as well for various statements and for the use of linked data vocabularies. And linked data vocabularies are something that we do want to move toward as they also offer some additional flexibility and the ability to connect things in different ways than we have been able to do with more traditional description schemas in the past. You do want to be a little bit careful with uh, Dublin Core. Dublin Core is extremely flexible, but you don't want to back yourself into a corner with Dublin Core. So yes, be flexible, but proceed with caution. And then this is just a statement from the Society of American Archivists reminding us that description must be iterative. It continually reflects a deeper understanding of agents, records, activities, and the relationships between them. It is responsive to users. It is flexible, reflecting changes in knowledge, practice, and values. So this is something to keep in mind as you're doing this work as well, that this is not one and done. This is something that's going to be part of your practice going forward. Language changes, context changes sometimes when we learn more, when we have more information. So just be aware that it's an iterative process. We're all learning. You're going to make mistakes. That's okay. We can go back and fix it. Just make sure you're documenting your process and all the changes that you're making so that you can make sure that you're not reverting back to something or revisiting something that doesn't need to be or was already reviewed, right? So just keep this in mind. It's not a perfect process and it's something you're going to have to keep going back to. Okay, so on to considerations. So we talked a little bit about this when we reviewed those harmful content and language statements, but you do really want to consider where you're placing your statements. So thinking about whether you want a very broad statement on your repository or your library website that talks about the work that you're doing, is transparent with the user, gives them some context for what you're trying to do, and also provides a reporting mechanism for them. Collection level statements that might provide some additional information about the materials people are going to be finding in that particular collection. So for example, at my organization, we do have a collection with Holocaust materials. That collection does have its own statement in addition to our repository statement, just because of the nature of the material that's in there. So we did choose to add an individual's collection statement there. You may want to link to your statement in your records. So rather than providing an individual statement um, on each record, you might just want to provide a link somewhere that's easily accessible from each record that goes to your general statement. You may decide that individual records might require something. So if you have material that's particularly sensitive, they want to provide additional context for, um, that might be something that you want to do. We have a lot of material related to civil rights and the Emmett Till case in particular. So adding context about lynchings or things like that in an individual record might also be appropriate there. Um, and then you might also consider, depending on your system, just providing a link in your search page. So DPLA does this. Um, if you go to dp.la and do a search, at the very top of the search results, there is a very prominent link to the repository level statement that they have about harmful content. So that if that's something you're able to do, that might make your statement a little bit more prominent than just a page that's hidden somewhere that someone might have to look for in your about information or something like that. So those are some considerations that you might want when looking about where to place any statements or contextual information that you're adding um, for the work that you're doing. Okay, when and where to make changes to a record. So some things to consider when making changes to individual records is considering the format of materials. So thinking about archivist created metadata versus item information, right? So some of our materials are going to come with uh, pre-existing titles or information if it's published material, or if the creator, like a photographer or an artist, provided uh, their own titles or information about the resource, right? So thinking about the format of the material, what you can change and what you can't change about that. So the title of a book is not something you can change, right? But maybe you can uh, provide a warning if uh, there's a racial slur in a title of something or something, or if it's using outdated language for a particular group of people or something like that. Um, but if it's archivist provided, then you have a little bit more flexibility to change titles and change language that's being used. And you may not need necessarily to add some of that additional context when it comes to published material. Again, thinking about system limitations, if there are collections that might have images that you are worried about, if there's the ability to have blurred thumbnails, or if your system allows for a pop-up to show up when people enter the collection page to say, hey, this collection contains sensitive material. If you don't want to see it, go back, that kind of thing. If your system allows for that or not. Considering what fields are available to you. So different systems may have flexibility in what schemas you can use. Most don't. So considering what fields you have available to you, what you can hide, what you can't hide. And then again, thinking about if your ILS or your digital library system or your finding aid system only allows you to pull from certain vocabularies. So that's another consideration when doing this. And then also considering where your records will be visible. So again, um, thinking about if your materials are aggregated somewhere or if they're being indexed in a search engine, and that may help make the decision about whether or not you want to add statements to individual items, so that that context doesn't get lost when people encounter them. Okay. How do you approach collections in languages other than English? Collections from other geographic regions or collections with other cultural considerations? So, positionality is really important here. So, thinking about your own experiences Your own knowledge is going to be really important here on whether or not you can make determinations about materials like this and when you might need to seek external expertise. You should definitely do that if you don't speak the language that the material is in. Um, and or if you are unsure because of your own lived experiences, right? So if you have a collection on LGBTQ material and you don't have ties to that community, or you're not don't have experience with that community, you're like cis and heterosexual, you may want to consult like a Pride Student Union or an LGBTQ group in your community to help you best select language for describing those materials. Um, this is also where language justice comes in. So, Florida, in particular, is a very multicultural state, right? And many people speak multiple languages. So, considering language justice and providing metadata both in the language the material is in and in English, so it's more easily searched and find and discoverable by the communities that speak that language. So, when you're able, um, incorporating that incorporating language justice principles in your description practices as well. So this is a really important consideration, as many of us do not come from the communities that the materials being described are uh, are from. So really consider that and examine your own positionality when coming to collections that you might need to seek external help with. Okay. And I think this is our final consideration. Yes. So complex materials with many subjects. So, what level of granularity are you going to be providing for context and materials? So, the decision here should probably be made at a policy level and not place a burden on on individuals to make determinations on this. So, considering like a 2 hour oral history or recording of a symposium or something like that, um, your policy may want to include suggestions for including descriptive language when we know content may be harmful. Um, you're not going to describe every single subject in like a 2 hour long video, right? That's just not feasible. We don't have time to sit there and watch the whole thing, much less um, record everything that might someone might encounter in this like 2 hour long video, right? But you may want to note that something does contain potentially harmful content if you know what the subject matter of the talk or the oral history might be. So um, do consider that um, and think about the complexity of the material that you're describing. Um, like a, a long oral history is going to have more complexity than like a pamphlet or something like that that you're describing. So just consider that as well, and the time that you're investing in examining the material for context. So this work also provides lots of opportunities in addition to considerations. Um, so it allows you to connect and work with communities that are represented in our collections, and it increases the accessibility of collections to unserved and underserved communities. Again, this is a really important consideration when we're looking at a material that's not in English, right? So language justice, how do we incorporate the native language of the material in the description so that it's more easily accessible by people who would use it? Um, Thinking about how we can build relationships and foster connections to community organizations within our organization, but also outside of it, so that our materials are more useful and we're using language that they would be using to search for these materials that would be relevant to them. So that's a really great opportunity to make and build those connections. And it also allows us to connect with each other as professionals in doing this work. So it allows us to have a continuous dialogue about our biases, how we connect our practice with theory and scholarship, and how we participate in social justice and reparative work that is sorely needed in a lot of our communities and organizations. So this is a really good opportunity to connect with each other about how we can practice this really important work. Okay, so now we're going to go on to a couple of examples. This is not a thorough, like, exhaustive list of examples, but this is an example of person first language, person first or identity first language. Now, identity first and person first language first came about through the disability community, and it allows people to be described as separate from um, like an identity that they might have, right? So here are some examples of language that you might want to avoid that may be something that was used in description or titles or things like that. And then alternatives that really center the person and their humanity rather than their identity. So here's a few examples of that. So, like, instead of wheelchair bound, you would say person who uses a wheelchair. And again, that centers the person rather than the fact that they're in a wheelchair, right? Um, someone who's an addict, you want to say person with a substance use disorder, right? So you're centering that person and their humanity over the addiction, or labeling their identity as such. So um, this came from the APA bias-free language guidelines. That's also linked here. I'll be sharing that. This has been really useful for us in identifying terms to look for that might be present in our metadata, but also providing solutions for alternatives for how we can reconfigure the way that we're writing our records. So this has been a really useful example. So really do want to look at person first language in any of the descriptions that you're providing, so that we're centering people instead of things. And then this is another example where we're doing person first language. So in this example, uh, we have the old language and language you might want to consider using. So this is describing a collection that documents the business dealings of a Black woman named Maria in 18th century Mexico. Now, centering her humanity and her individuality before her identity, we would say that the collection documents the business dealings of Maria, a Black woman in 18th century Mexico. So we're centering her first, and we're identifying her, and then her identity is like second fold to that. It's an important part of the context of the collection, but it's about Maria, not about her identity, right? So thinking about that. And then you also want to describe relationships of power when they're important for understanding the context of records. And the example that we have here is that Thomas Jefferson was a known enslaver despite his legacy as a supporter of individual rights. So this places an onus on Thomas Jefferson. It contrasts like his what he was a proponent of versus like the practice that he actually lived, you know, and it places an onus and identifies him as an enslaver rather than just saying he was a landowner or a plantation owner. He owned people. So we want to make sure that that is also centered and adds appropriate context to records that we might have about a person. And then this is some example about laudatory, aggrandizing, and flowery language. So we want to refrain from using this kind of language because it does place a bias on the material. So here's an example of some terms like preeminent, renowned, genius, seminal, that would praise a collection or its creators. Um, you want to ask yourself, does this piece of information help users better understand the collection, or or does it only justify the collection's creator's stature, right? So is this relevant in any way? Um, and for the most part, it is not. uh, so this is an example of what not to do. Um, so in addition to his work as a lawyer, Hayes wrote an astounding number of books and articles. As a gifted writer and eloquent debater, he added his perspective to virtually every individual's rights issue of his day. His autobiography, entitled City Lawyer, The Autobiography of a Law Practice, provides a colorful account of his more noteworthy cases, and his articles and book reviews demonstrate his wide-ranging knowledge of a nation and a world experiencing dramatic change in the way individual rights were perceived. So in this description, we probably don't need to include uh the part that's he was a an astounding that he wrote an astounding number of books. That's not really factual information. Instead of an astounding number of books, you can just put the number of books that he wrote. um you can instead of saying he was a gifted writer and eloquent debater, you can just start with he added his perspective to virtually every individual rights issue of his day. um, this is not necessarily relevant to the context of the collection, right? Is this useful information for the user? Also, people are not really searching for these kinds of words, right? um, so is there really a need to include them in your description? Okay. And then this is our last round of examples. Um, so something else you want to consider is unlearning the neutral voice of traditional archival description. So rather than striving for an objective voice, which reinforces existing power structures, based description in the question, as posed by Michelle Caswell, is the descriptive language I am using respectful to the larger communities of people invested in this record? So you want to decenter neutrality and objectivity in favor of respect and care. So here are some examples of how to avoid passive voice and neutral voice. Um, this first example is what the original record looked like. 4 Kent State University students were killed on May 4th, 1970, during a clash between the Ohio National Guard and a crowd gathered to protest the Vietnam War. So again, that's very passive and very neutral. Instead, you might consider members of the Ohio National Guard killed 4 Kent State University students during mass protests against the Vietnam War. So this places the onus on the National Guard. It's less passive. It's still factual. It's still what happened, but it doesn't take the responsibility away from any of the actors in the event. So it does provide the appropriate context while also eliminating any kind of neutrality that we might want to be imposing on the record. It also provides respect to the students who were killed in this event. So that's the last example that I have. This is a list of resources that we use to prepare this presentation, but also that can be used during our discussion and our in your work to reference. I will be sharing a link to this in the chat, so you can all look at this during your discussions and also reference later. I'll also be sending a link to the slides when I send a link to the recording. Okay. So now we have reached the portion of the day where we will go out. Well, how many people are here? There's 13 people here. We're not going to do breakout rooms. We're just going to talk in this group. But before we go into our prescribed discussion questions, I wanted to see if anyone in this group had questions about the presentation or the content or about the process. So I'm gonna enable people to unmute themselves if they'd like. You can also post any questions in the chat if you have them. Yes, Natalie.
Hi, Kayla. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Hi. Thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering, I don't know if any general cataloging departments are ready to, well, maybe some are implement fully this kind of work into their everyday work, but I'm interested in doing, whatever small ways I can do in my everyday work. Of course, I know this is conscious editing is generally more geared towards special collections and collections that, just generally have outdated records and more harmful material. But, sometimes you can utilize it in your general collection as well. And I was wondering how you would go about prioritizing your time and resources as you go through your general collection, because we items need to be pushed out generally a lot faster for general cataloging than they do for special collections. So I was wondering if you had any advice on how to prioritize that.
Yeah, sure. So I think especially when we're looking at cataloging like general collection materials that might come with like a prepared record from OCLC or something like that, we can look to make sure that the subject headings that came with it are actually accurate and relevant to the material that it is, right? So you're actually looking at the book as you're cataloging it. Um, I've seen examples of like records that might use African American as a subject heading or African American men or something like that as a subject heading, but it's about people in Africa, and not necessarily about African Americans. So, like, just making sure that the subject headings assigned to that material is actually accurate and relevant to the actual content of the work, right? So, uh, also keeping up to date with any changes that the Library of Congress has made to subject headings. You can subscribe to changes that they've made. They publish all of those changes after they have meetings to update them. So recently, the Library of Congress changed blacks and whites to black people and white people. Um, and that's a more inclusive subject heading. It's more, it again goes back to like that person first kind of um, uh, principle, instead of some of those outdated terms that we used to use to identify people based on their race. Uh, so thinking about like where standards are changing and keeping up to date on that. So and then just making sure that things are accurate and being accurately applied. Um, is a good way to kind of prioritize doing a little bit of that work. Another way you can contribute actively to some of these changes for more standardized description is joining a Seiko funnel group. Um, uh, the Library of Congress has several groups that work to update LCSH headings. A lot of these groups include subject experts, and they have actually been more active in the last few years in updating LCSH headings. And the Library of Congress has open meetings where suggestions for updating subject headings are open to the public, so anyone can attend and comment and provide their perspective on any potential changes. So those are some ways that you can contribute and prioritize a little bit. Is just really focus on accuracy and not necessarily on like doing bulk changes or anything like that. Another way to look at it too, one of our catalogers here has approached it as like a professional development kind of thing, right? So how do we incorporate alternative vocabularies into certain types of materials? So they took our ebooks collection and examined LGBTQ material and took that as a professional development opportunity to learn how to apply homosaurus subject headings to that material in addition to the LCSH headings. So allowing yourself to take that as a professional development opportunity and present it as such. Like this helps me expand beyond the existing structure of LCSH and makes me a better cataloger, right? So thinking about it that way too. Was that helpful? Okay, good. And then we have a question in the chat. Do we know if adding harmful language statements is useful for users? That is a great question, Jimena. I think yes and no. Um, I think if it's buried, no, right? Like if you, I think for the most part, repository level statements that are just like linked from an about page or something like that are not useful because people are not looking for that. They're not going there. They're not going to be reading it, right? Um, I think yes, if it's more specific, right? So if you're adding a language statement to a collection, or if you're specifically looking at a record and adding context to it, right? So like if it's about the content of the material rather than the descriptive language, I think a language statement in a record like that would be useful. So it lets people know that you might encounter racial slurs in this, or you might encounter outdated language about this group of people in this material itself. I think that is useful. My understanding of the feedback forms that a lot of institutions have put up is they're not really getting a lot of feedback in those, but I don't think that's terribly surprising. Most people that are visiting finding aid or digital library repositories are going there to find one thing, download it, and leave. So I think they are useful. I think it depends. Um, but I would say they are. It doesn't hurt. Okay. Do we have any other questions? Did that answer your question, Jimena? Okay. I am going to stop the recording now.